Hi everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons, and today I've got a tutorial and a pattern to share with you. So the pattern is for this tank top which I've upcycled from old jumpers, and I'm giving the pattern away free. So if you'd like to receive the pattern, all you need to do is check the details below the video and follow the link to sign up to receive the pattern. So now I'm going to show you how to make it. So I've gathered together a mixture of old sweaters. So this is a mixture of unloved sweaters that I don't want anymore and charity shop finds. So the first thing I'm going to do is decide which part of which sweater I'm going to use for each parts of the tank top, and then I'm going to start cutting along the seams to sort of dismantle the sweaters in the quickest and easiest way possible. So I've decided I'm going to use this one for the front and the back of the tank top, and then I'm going to use the ribs from the other jumpers for the neck, the arm bands and the hem band. But I'm going to keep the pieces of the other jumpers that I don't use, and I'm going to share some more tutorials with different things to make with those. So I'm just going to start by cutting along the seam lines, not cutting any of the main part of the jumpers, just cutting along the seam lines so that I've got large pieces that I can use to cut my my pattern out. So I've completely cut this piece of the jumper out, so around all the seams, so it's now a nice flat piece of fabric. So what I'm going to do now is place my pattern on. Because this jumper has this lovely pattern that's sort of centralised in the middle of the panel, I'm going to try and do the same and keep this in the centre. So this piece is actually going to be the back of the tank top. So the first thing I need to do is work out where the centre of my pattern is going to fall and where I want to position the stripes. It has this sort of box in the middle. I'm quite happy to have that sort of high up at the back of the neck and then try and do something similar on the front. So I'm just going to measure the pattern. So this is measuring 27 centimetres for my size. So together that's going to be 54 centimetres. So I'm going to have the centre is just going to be in the middle of this stripe here. So I'm going to place my pattern so that that comes in the middle of that line there to keep it nice and symmetrical. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh that down with some weights and draw around one side of the pattern and flip it over and draw around the other side of the pattern. I'm just using some chalk here. It's going to be a little bit tricky to mark onto this sweater fabric, but hopefully I can see this. Now I'm going to put a mark in the centre where I'm going to need to flip the pattern to draw the other side in. And I'll take those weights off and flip the pattern. Let's line that up with the mark that I just made. And now I'm just going to weigh that down and do the same on this side. So now we're ready to start cutting it. So if you are struggling to see the lines a bit, you can always place the pattern back on and just redraw bits that you can't see, or you could pin it on and then cut it around if you prefer to, but I just like to see that my pattern is even, because obviously with knitwear it moves around quite a lot and I want to try and keep it nice and symmetrical. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that, and then I'm going to do the same with the front panel as well. Struggling to see it a little bit here, so I'm just going to place that back on. I can see the angle there and the angle here, so I'm just going to redraw that. So the next thing we need to do is to cut out the hem bands, arm bands and neck bands. The pattern is slightly on the large side because obviously all jumpers will stretch slightly differently. So what I would recommend is that you pin and tack your bands on and just have a look how they're sitting before you actually sew them, because you might find you need to reduce the length of any of the bands depending on the stretch of the jumper to make it sit right. So for this top, I've found that the dark grey rib on the bottom of the jumper was exactly the right depth and the right length according to the pattern, so I've just simply cut that off and gone ahead with that. And then I've tried to, I wanted to get the arm bands out of the same out of the rib from this jumper, but unfortunately they were nowhere near long enough. So what I've done is I've actually cut these out of the grey jumper as well, but I've cut them double the width, and I plan to fold them in half and sew them on double, so obviously I've got a finished edge here. I've chosen this one because it's the lighter of all the jumpers. If it's very thick, it's going to be really difficult to get through the overlocker. This one is still quite thick, but I'm hoping it's going to work because that's the fabric that I'm working with. And then lastly, I've got the neck band, and again here I'm just slightly short according to the pattern. So I'm going to hope that this is still going to work despite being a little bit short. So I'm just going to place the pattern on the edge, and this inner edge will be the neck edge. So I'm going to place that edge along the edge of the rib and just pin that on and cut that out as long as I can. I'm just pinning this together so that I can cut through both layers at one time, hopefully. You can see there when I straighten it out, we're about, in total, 3 centimetres short. I'm going to cut that. So what I would do now before you do any sewing at all on the top, because it's very simple to make, but the overlocker may well need adjusting. So I would just test out a few pieces of the scrap and see how it's sewing. So I've just tested out the folded rib, which was not what I'd planned to do initially, and to see if that works, and that does actually seem to work quite nicely. But what I have noticed is I am going to need to change the differential feed, because can you see how it's actually curving quite a lot and it's stretching it out? So I'm going to need to move the dial down to the 2 end of the scale to bring that into a nice flat seam. I'm going to go ahead and try a couple of tests on the main fabric as well just before I start sewing, and then we're ready to make it. So the first thing I've done is stay stitch the edges, because obviously this is cut knitwear. It's going to unravel and stretch and be quite difficult to work with, so I'm just hoping to keep this nice and flat and not distorted as I sew it. And we've got to work with it really quite delicately because it is cut edges. So we're going to start by sewing the shoulder seams together. So right sides together and the front and back at the shoulder seams. So what I'm going to do is, again, to help sort of stabilise it, is I'm going to use a bit of cotton tape and just sew a normal line of the 1 centimetre seam allowance over this, and then I'm going to overlock it afterwards, and that will prevent the shoulders from stretching. So I'm just going to put some clips in to hold that in place, and then I'm going to sew the seam first. You can use a straight stitch for this sewing on the sewing machine, because obviously you're working on a woven tape, so there's going to be no stretch in this seam at all. So I've stitched the shoulder seams and overlocked those, and then what I've also done is I've just individually overlocked the side seams to stop them fraying, and I plan to sew the side seams together using a small zigzag stitch on the sewing machine. So the next thing to do is the neckband. This is going to be the trickiest bit. Everything after this will be quite straightforward. So I've found with my neckband that actually it was a double folded edge, so I've been able to open the neckband out and stitch around the raw edges of the V. If your band is made from a piece that's not folded on the edge, I'd recommend that you overlock the raw edges. Let me just fold this. So if you're sewing it like this, I'd overlock these edges, and you'll have to hand finish them to make a neat V at the front. Just hand stitch the seam probably to the back to make that look a bit neat. But in this case I've been able to go inside and stitch around that, and I'm going to be able to turn that through and make a really nice neat front V. So I'm just going to clip into that V point there, just being careful not to cut the stitches, and then press those together, and I'm going to trim these pieces up to make a nice sharp point at the front there. So I'm just going to go and press that, and then we're ready to stitch that into the neckline. So we're going to put the V into the point at the front neck. So what I've done is I've made a little clip into the very centre of that V, and we now need to line the centre of the V up with the centre of the V neck. So if we just put a pin there, that's our centre points matched, and now all we want to do is stitch for about 5 or 6 centimetres ahead of that point on this side, pivot, and then stitch 5 or 6 centimetres up this side. So it's pretty difficult to manage getting that 100% accurate, and I'd say it's personal preference whether you find it easier to work on the rib side up or the jumper side up. But the aim is to get that V nice and straight. So I'm going to try stitching it with the rib side up, but you might prefer to try stitching it with the jumper side up, and just pivoting at that V so that we have a nice clean point. In the end I did decide to go with the jumper side uppermost, because I found it quite tricky to know where I'm passing this cut edge because it's very, very short at that distance. And you see that. So the point is stitched in. And that's all that's stitched in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to match the centre back to the centre back of the tank top. So I haven't got a mark as such, and I'm not going to cut nicks into this knitwear because you won't see them. So I'm just going to fold it and just check my centre point and just put a pin there. So that's where I bring the neckband to. Making sure you've got right sides together. And once I know that's in position, I can take that pin and use it to hold that in place. So now I'm just going to stretch this, and like I said, I'm going to tack it on and just check it looks okay before I stitch it. And if I'm happy with it, then I'm going to go ahead and stitch it. I've clipped that on evenly, so now I'm just going to tack around that edge, and basically tacking it is also another way of helping you stretch it and get it prepared for the overlocker. So we're going to need to keep these raw edges all together, so by tacking it, it just helps manage the process. You've got less things to think about when you come to actually stitching it. So I'm just going to stretch it into position and then tack it. You can use fairly large tacking stitches, about 1 centimetre. It's just helping me manage those raw edges together. There we go. So I think that's not looking too bad. It's not looking too tight. I think when this is stitched, that will look okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that. So there we go, stitched. The tacking threads are still in, but steaming is like a magic trick for jersey or knitwear. So it's just flattened that out really nicely. If anything, I'm just slightly squiffy there, but I'm happy with that. I'm going to leave that as it is. So now what I'm going to do is join the side seam. So like I said, I'm going to sew these together using a shallow zigzag stitch on the sewing machine and pressing those seams open so they don't become too bulky. So just put right sides together and line up your overlocked edges, and then we can just stitch down at each side with our 1 centimetre seam allowance. So you can use clips or pins. So just stitching along here. So those seams are now stitched, and I've pressed the seam open, and I've also made the bands. So I've got the arm bands prepared, so they're just overlocked together, and these ones are going to be folded so wrong sides are together and raw edges matched and applied around the armhole. And then the hem band is just single because the edge is already finished. So that one, the way I've stitched that is I started overlocking, and then I pulled the overlock thread in front of the foot and stitched it in, so it's a finished edge at that point. But you can also just thread the end of the overlocking through the eye of a wide-eyed needle and send that back through the seam just to finish that and stop that from fraying. So now we're just going to put those onto the top, and then it'll be finished. So I'm going to start by putting the armbands on. So I'm going to fold the armhole edge in half, and actually the shoulder point and the underarm point are good halfway points. So if we bring those 2 points together, so we're basically marking the halfway points and the quarter points on the armhole. So I'm not going to put any nicks again because they will just fray away. So I'm just going to put a pin at the point there to mark that quarter point. And then obviously we know the seams are the halfway points, and lay that flat and just find the quarter point of that one. So I'm going to do the same with the other armhole and the same with the hem. So we've got quarters marked on all of these raw edges. So again, we've got halfway points on here. We can just bring those together, those halfway points together, and mark the quarters. So the centre front and the centre back become the quarter points. And now what we need to do is do exactly the same on the bands. So for the hem band, we'll start with the side seam. In fact, this one's got 2 side seams because we used the band from the original jumper, and then put those together and mark the points there. And now I'm going to do the same with the armbands. So we've got a seam that was already from the original jumper, and then I'm going to bring those together with the seam that I created and just put a mark at that point. So I'm going to do both edges because I want to make sure that the band doesn't twist, and then I'll do the same with the other arm band. And then just like I did with the neck edge, I'm going to clip them on and potentially tack them if I'm not 100% sure that the fit's right, because I don't want to have to unpick this. It's going to be really tricky and messy to unpick. So let's start with the hem band. So I'm going to match right sides together and raw edges together, and start by putting that point. And I'm going to move round and find my next mark and match that with the one on the band. Here you can see there isn't a huge amount of stretch on this, but I deliberately wanted it to be quite boxy and easy fitting around the waist. I didn't want it particularly pulled in, so I'm happy with that. Then I'm going to match the side seam to the side seam. And those last 2 points together. And just as I did before, I'll stretch and tack, and then if I'm happy I'll sew it. And then for the arm bands, the armhole edges, Let's find the one that I have marked. So I'm going to fold the raw edges together, and then I'm going to put one of the seams of the armband at the underarm seam. So I've got raw edges matched, so this time I've got 3 thicknesses. I'm going to put that one together, pin that to the shoulder seam. That's slightly off, but I'm just going to trim that up, I think. Match that. I'm going to bring those pins into alignment and mark that. And I'll do exactly the same on the other armhole, so all are ready to sew once I'm happy that they fit nicely. So I'm going to go ahead now and just pull and tack that as I did with the neckband, and then I'm going to sew them. So there we go, all finished. I'll stitch the armholes and the hemband. All I've got left to do is just take out the tacking threads. I've given it a bit of a press on the armholes, which looks nice. I didn't press the lower edge because I wanted to keep that soft. And that's it, finished. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. Don't forget to check the link below to sign up for your free copy of the pattern. And if you'd like to see more tutorials and videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.